All right. Testing, testing. Looks like we're good to go. Welcome to the very first presentation of our 100% solar residential off-grid masterclass. So I recently had a Twitter follower ask me, hey, I live in India. Can you design a solar array for me? Now, my past program content has been very much geared towards the US market, and this course is still geared towards the US market, but one thing that is wonderful about off-grid solar is that it can work anywhere. So perhaps this is the most universal solar program that I've ever taught before. It's also my first time to work with Google Slides rather than PowerPoint, so you'll have to bear with me. I have a few different presentation tools going, and so if I'm fuddling around with them, that'll all smooth out as we start to iterate this presentation. But this is our first go, and this program is hot off the presses. I finished it yesterday, so all the content here is up to date. What we're going to do in this program is first start out with some arguments on why you should consider going off-grid, even when perhaps the electric grid is close to you, or maybe your home already has a grid connection. Why would you turn your back on the grid in order to go off-grid? It's expensive to go off-grid. It's wasteful to go off-grid if you have a reliable grid connection. But as much as I would like free market economics to be in the energy sector, they're not. And in many cases, the cards are stacked against the solar array owner. And so that can result in an instance where it might be actually more cost effective to go off grid than to remain grid connected. Not in all markets. If you have a public utility commission that is looking after your best interests, off grid may not be for you. But in my market in Mississippi, there are certainly real examples where it is more cost effective to go off grid than to remain grid connected. And the more a utility pushes back on the solar industry, the more likely that will become a trend, for better or worse. Now, this is not just a soapbox for me to rail against anti-solar policy. We're going to get into real design examples. We'll talk about electrical analysis. So there's an issue where, what if it's new construction and you have no clue what the home really needs in terms of an off-grid system? That can, put some hair on your chest in terms of saying, well, give me a whole bunch of money, I'll build you an off-grid system, and I'm confident that you won't run out of electricity. That's you're promising a lot. It's not just like a grid-tied solar array where if the solar array does not work for whatever reason, you still have access to electricity. If you mess up your design in an off-grid design, your client runs out of electricity, and that's a more dangerous scenario than doing grid-tied solar. And so we want to make sure that we do it correctly. So we will learn how to take just the monthly electrical use of a customer and then model an off-grid home or building off that. And so if it's new construction, what I recommend doing is finding out what the customer's current electric bill is, and we'll learn how to make assumptions off of that for your new design. Battery selection and maintenance. Unlike in our previous battery program, we're going to kind of hone in on why you would select a certain battery for off-grid living. And what we'll learn is that grid-connected batteries and off-grid batteries are very different from each other. A grid-connected battery is high voltage and low amperage. It's really used to reduce your electric bill. And what we'll learn is that the backup power capabilities of a grid-connected battery really aren't very good. Whereas for an off-grid battery, we more commonly see lower voltage, higher amperage battery banks, and we see large battery banks that are intended to power a whole home. So we'll look at some of that, and that really drives your selection on whether or not you're going to use a lithium-ion battery bank or a flooded lead-acid battery bank. Inverter selection. Battery inverters are expensive. They're a two-way street, whereas a solar array, where you're just taking the electricity from the solar array and dumping it into your load, that's a one-way street. And so we could rightly assume that a battery inverter is going to be twice as expensive as a regular solar inverter. But that's not the entire story. We will get into that in that section. Finally, to round out the first 3 hours, we will talk about National Electric Code with regard to the control room that your components will go inside. So we'll say, what is a good amount of space to put into your building for housing, these large lead-acid battery banks for your inverters? What are we looking at in terms of maintenance? Do they need to go inside or do they need to go outside? We'll take a look at that with regard to building and, in particular, National Electric Code. The last 3 hours of the program, we will get further into a racking discussion, kind of deviate a little bit from just a pure inverter battery discussion and talk about module level panel electronics, which are not intended to be used for off-grid. I mean, you can use them for off-grid, but the manufacturers of these module level panel electronics are kind of slow to the off-grid market. They're going after the grid-connected market. But I'm a big fan of module level panel electronics right now, mainly out of necessity. In Mississippi, where I'm located, we get very tall trees. And, solar is not supposed to go in the shade, but partial shade conditions are okay. But if you have any amount of shade on your rooftop, module level panel electronics are generally how you want to go. And I've developed a installation technique that really alleviates a lot of my concern about, well, you're increasing your labor and you're increasing your wiring, and that's going to cause failure, and you're inviting more damage because of squirrels and other pests living on your roof getting into the wires. We'll spend a little bit of time talking about that. Also, we'll talk about tracking. Now, residential tracking is not really the standard option, and we'll talk about the reasons why. I'm a fan of tracking. I think that single-axis tracking offers a lot of opportunity to the residential market, particularly in the off-grid market, where your customers tend to have enough land around the house to put a residential tracker. Also, you have to think about serviceability. If something's down on the ground, maybe you have more dust and debris, washing onto the modules, and you have to clean them. But at the same time, it's down on the ground, so it's pretty easy to service as opposed to up on the rooftop. So we'll talk about some racking and tracking considerations about halfway through the program. Generator selection, a gas generator, you may not use it very often in an off-grid system, and we'll look at the cost to run a natural gas or a propane generator, and we'll conclude that, hey, we really don't want to have to rely on our generator. If you have an off-grid customer, you're dealing with a payback that, in the best case scenario, the system payback is going to be 12 years. It can be even longer than that. And if you're running your generator often, it's usually going to be cost effective to go with a larger battery bank to avoid that habitual generator runtime in the winter, just because of the cost of gasoline. But what we'll learn is how you can actually model that decision so you can decide it for yourself for your specific application. One-line diagrams, we will show you how to kind of start out your one-line diagram, and then what I do to kind of finish it up, because a lot of the solar design tools and software that are on the market today, they're not focused on off-grid. So you have to we'll look at off-grid wiring diagrams and the capabilities of one-line diagram software, and then figure out how to kind of smush them together so that if you do in fact need to get a permit for your off-grid system, one thing that's nice about off-grid is you don't need an interconnection application. You're off-grid, no more dealing with the utility, and if you have a utility that is particularly slow on permitting, maybe that alone would be a reason to go off grid. But we'll learn how, if your building inspection department says, well, even though you're not interconnected to the grid, it's still electrical work, you still need to be a licensed contractor to bid on it, you still need to get a building permit. We'll show you how to generate the diagrams to get through that process. We'll also spend some time getting into maybe something you've never seen in a solar design class before, which is a true smart home in terms of how do we connect our solar production to our electrical load. We don't just need to rely on a battery bank to use the surplus power during the day in order to load shift and maybe use more power during the day and less power at night. But at the same time, we don't want to become a slave to our electrical system. So what can we do to get our home to do some of these tasks for us? For example, how do we get our thermostat to talk to our solar array so that during the day you can crank the air conditioning and use thermal mass inside your home to chill the building, so that in the evening your home stays cooler a little bit longer, just based off its own thermal mass, so that you don't have to run the air conditioning as much at night, and that alone will improve your battery bank life. And then finally, we'll get into a concept that I call Franken-solar, which is really going further than what the solar manufacturers will want you to go with their systems. So you might find that you really like, say, the SolarEdge platform, and you want to do an off-grid SolarEdge system. Well, SolarEdge says, well, if you go off-grid, we're going to void your warranty. Well, okay, but if my off-grid system is $80,000 and my SolarEdge inverter is $1,000, do I really care about my SolarEdge warranty anymore, or do I really just want to know what works and what doesn't work? So I don't think that any solar program has really gotten into saying, okay, well, your manufacturers are not going to like you using their grid-connected products off-grid, but how do we start combining them together? Another key point of this Franken-solar concept will be how to combine multiple battery chemistries, because based on our battery selection discussion, we'll see that lithium-ion is a great battery technology. It's expensive, so you can't afford to take a whole house off-grid with lithium-ion batteries. as compared to lead acid. At the same time, for peak load management, where your load is bouncing up and down with your air conditioner turning on and off, it would be easier on your battery bank for your flooded lead acid just to kind of provide your base load, and your lithium ion to provide your volatile load. And your manufacturers, they simply do not support that functionality at this time. And so you might look into your system budgets and say, well, you know what? It's going to be more cost effective for me to do a system that combines multiple technologies, that uses solar edge in an off-grid setting, that allows me to go and use a unlisted, maybe not unlisted for grid connection, off-grid inverter, and put them together so that they work and communicate, and that might result in cost savings that are worth more than the warranty value of those products. So if you really want to sharpen your solar design skill, that's kind of the big payoff at the end of this presentation, is learning what I call a Franken solar concept, where you take a little bit of technology from column A and a little bit of technology from column B and get them all to work together in ways that have never been done before. So with that, let's just go ahead and dive right into the program. Arguments against the grid. So we'll talk about the cost of grid expansion, the cost of being grid connected, also some arguments about grid reliability. I was at my Public Utility Commission meeting the other day, and what I would like in Mississippi is for the Public Utility Commission to clarify that customers have the right to go off grid. And the comment was, oh, well, what will the customer do at night? Because solar doesn't work at the night. Well, okay, well, I personally, if I want to go off grid, I'm going to be buying a battery to store the electricity. So I don't really think that that's a very good counter argument to forcing a customer to be on grid, because the solar panels won't work at night. The sun comes up every single day. If the sun doesn't come up, we're going to have problems at a cosmic level. I don't think anyone's going to be worrying about electricity if the sun drops out of the sky. And I don't think that's going to happen, and you don't think that's going to happen. The sun is very reliable, and batteries take care of times when your solar array is not going to be productive. However, what's interesting about regulated monopolies is that they have been created to provide reliable electricity to regions where it's thought that providing electricity out to those regions would otherwise be uncost effective. And so in Mississippi, they give a utility a monopoly to say, okay, this is your service territory, and because it's in the interest of reliable electricity, safe electricity, and cost-effective electricity, you have the right to monopolize this area. Well, now we have those same utilities failing to provide good solar options to individual customers. And one argument those customers could do is go to the Public Utility Commission and say, look, I have a cost-effective solar array. It would be much more safe for a third party to maintain it than me, because I don't know anything about electricity or batteries, and John with Community Solar knows a heck of a lot more than I do and has all the right tools and equipment to maintain it. And as far as reliability goes, we're starting to lose power 4 times a year living in one of the largest cities in Mississippi, just because someone runs into an electrical pole and it takes out the local circuit. And that doesn't even get into bad weather. And so we'll talk about some arguments on the reliability of off-grid. You have the concern with the customer that says, well, can I really live off-grid, because what happens if I run out of power? And if you run out of power, it's because your designer didn't do a very good job. But you can design an off-grid system so that you have enough power for your system to be reliable, just like with the electric grid. We have our electric grid designed to generate enough power so that our electric grid remains reliable. What happens with unreliable electric grids is they get wiped out during a disaster. And then all of a sudden, what was a reliable electric grid, the disaster strikes, and then the grid becomes very unreliable. And I know that with my off-grid customers, when a storm system moves through Mississippi, they're sitting pretty because they say, you know what, the grid may go down, trees may fall over the power lines, drivers may run into these utility poles. A squirrel may chew up a power line and it cause a cascading effect that takes out the whole eastern seaboard, but I'm generating my own electricity on my property. It's being stored in my battery bank. I have a monitor that shows me how much electricity I have. That storm system comes in and I'm expecting neighbors to show up at my house because I'm going to be the only one that has electricity. And so, off-grid customers, if they are facing an issue where the Public Service Commission may say, oh, well, you can't go off grid, or, where this really comes into is, does a third-party provider have the right to sell a financed off-grid system to one of these customers? So, I'm not allowed to sell electricity to a customer if they're already in a regulated region. But what happens if they want to go off grid and their current grid monopoly says, well, we're going to give you terrible solar policy to begin with, and we're not going to give you any off-grid financing options. That's a direct threat to that consumer's individual health, safety, and welfare, and that's a strong argument that they can use to go to the Public Service Commission to get that monopoly decertified. And I think that should happen aggressively and rapidly, especially in these parts of the grid where, there's parts of the grid in Mississippi where you only have 5 customers per mile of power line. And, our price of electricity is right about grid average. So it's like we're at grid average pricing, but extremely small numbers of customers per mile of power line there is to maintain, and that's just not a sustainable system. So if you're looking after yourself, you might say, hey, I don't believe that Mississippi's electric grid is going to stay at retail price of electricity in a safe, stable, reliable manner for very long. We'll talk about some of those arguments you could actually present to a public utility commission to perhaps get out of your regulated monopoly and provide, and seek financing from a third party. We'll also look at some of the shortcomings of grid-tied battery inverters. So there's a lot of battery inverters out there, Enphase, SolarEdge. They all make these batteryless inverters. And then they come in with a battery option. So with the SolarEdge, you can add an LG Chem lithium-ion battery to it. They say, so that's for backup power. But if I'm a customer and I have a solar array and then I add a battery, I think, okay, I'm, during a blackout, most customers think the solar array will work without batteries during a blackout, and that's simply not true. There's some SMA has a feature where with it, you'll get a dedicated outlet during the day, but it's like having one power outlet on your wall. It's not a lot of power. It's not enough power to provide your own home with. And so then you go and you buy a $6,000 LG Chem battery, lithium ion, and you tack it onto your SolarEdge, and you think, okay, great. Well, now I have a solar array and I have a battery, so when the grid goes down, my home will still have power. Well, we'll learn that that's not true. I mean, we'll learn that these grid-tied batteries, will power backup systems that are often not even strong enough to run an air conditioner. And at least in the southern part of the United States, if I have to choose one thing that's going to stay on during a power outage, okay, my one thing might be my refrigerator. But item number 2 is probably my air conditioner. I'll go without TV or internet or lights. Just give me my fridge and my AC, and I'll be fine. Well, we'll see that a lot of grid-tied batteries can't even support an air conditioner, and so for those reasons, you might just say, well, what about going off grid completely? So let's go ahead and get into this section. One area where we talk about an $80,000 off-grid solar array, and you would be right to assume that that's a lot of money. It is. I mean, hey, that's if you're paying $200 a month on your electric bill, $2,400 a year, well, you'd still be looking at a pretty long payback for an off-grid system. But where a lot of off-grid systems are sold is for new construction. So let's say you go into an area, a part of Colorado, or maybe just moving out into the country in your own neck of the woods. You move further enough outside the city and you get into larger plots of land, and even though the power lines may go right next to the property, if you want to build in the center of your property, generally what you're going to say is the power line will put, maybe one pole to your property and then hang the transformer and put in your electric service. But they have, once those costs to expand the grid out to your property start to escalate, they will charge you for it. And so and this is pretty uniform across the country. But if you are wanting to build 500 feet away from where the power line runs across your property, so if you don't want to live right on the edge of the road where you're listening to traffic, you have this big piece of land, you might as well put it to use. Well, if you want to live 500 feet away and they're hanging a transformer, it may cost you $12.5 to $15,000. At least in my neck of the woods in Mississippi, it was for one off-grid customer. He wanted to live about 2,000 feet away from the edge of his property line, and his cost was around $20,000. And so at that point, you may say, okay, well, if I already want to do solar, so I'm spending $20,000 on a solar array, and the utility is charging me $20,000 to do a grid connection to bring the power lines out to my property. Well, what if I just spent that money on a battery bank instead? Could I just go off grid? And even in that, it's kind of obvious. If you're going to spend that money either way, you're either going to spend it on the grid connection or on your battery bank. And so the customer really has a decision to make to say, well, if I expand the grid out to my point of use, then I have the grid reliability, but I've also spent the budget that I've had that I could have spent on a battery. So, we get back into that reliability issue, and we'll cover that a little bit more. But grid expansion costs, it's cheaper in rural areas than it is in urban environments. And overhead power lines are cheaper than going underground. Now, if I'm in a rural environment and I'm building a solar ground mount, unless I'm in a very rocky soil type, maybe in like New Hampshire or Maine, where you get big granite rocks underneath the soil, then I'm going to go overhead with my power lines from my ground mount back to the house. But normally in a rural environment, I'm renting a trencher and I'm putting the power lines underground. We can see how in a suburban environment, going with your underground wires can get quite expensive. If you have to tear up New York City, Manhattan to lay down some power cable, that's a costly proposal. We do see that in rural environments, it's a little bit cheaper to put in power lines than in urban or suburban environments. And so these are just some cost figures you can use to say, okay, well, if I have power near my property and I want to expand it out, what am I looking at in terms of cost? Of course, what we also see is that there's a huge range depending on, I guess, a number of things. The price of metal, the price of labor, another cost beyond grid expansion. So grid expansion is kind of obvious. If you're living on a piece of property where it's going to cost you tens of thousands of dollars to bring out power to where you want to be, you should consider going off grid instead. But what if you aren't spending that money to bring the grid out there? What if you already have power on your property? So I'm doing a site evaluation soon for a customer who said, hey, I want to do solar. So, okay, well, your utility has this program and it's okay, but we could also do off-grid. She said, well, it's new construction. I say, well, great, tell me a little bit more, because if it's new construction, that's when going with a solar array and a battery can start to make more sense. And she says, well, we've already brought the power out to the property and the utilities hung the transformer and electric service for the construction equipment. It's like, oh, well, that was a missed opportunity to save some money. And I've done an off-grid home where it's the solar array gets built first, and then the power from the solar array powers the construction equipment to build the rest of the house. So a right-sized off-grid solar array can power your heavier duty loads because it's supposed to. It's supposed to be a very large, powerful system. It's supposed to power your entire house without hiccup and so it needs to be powerful. When they say, oh, well, solar can't power power tools because their startup loads are 3 times as much as their operating loads, well, you design your system to accommodate those startup loads so that it's all right. But there's still a cost to being connected to the grid. And, I live in the city, and my monthly meter fee is $15 a month, and that includes some other city services like trash collection. So that's a pretty good deal. I'm on a city electric grid. I pay a fixed cost of $15 a month, and I get some services beyond just electricity with that $15. Hey, that's a deal. I'll take it. But then you get into other grids where that meter fee starts to increase. If I go outside the city and I go onto the rural electric cooperative, all of a sudden the meter fee goes from $14 a month to $28 a month. And that doesn't include trash collection. So, going right outside into the rural co-ops, your fixed fees start to increase. So I did a survey across the country of all the different electric rate structures and who had the highest fixed meter fees. What kind of rate structures had the highest fixed meter fees? And these are just some of the types. So one was mountaintop. And so the power company in Colorado says, well, if you're going to go live on top of that mountain, it's a rural environment. We have to push that electricity pretty far to service you. We're going to charge you a high fixed fee to make sure we get enough revenue to provide that service to you. Master apartments, where you might just have one main meter for multiple units. That's okay. Well, you're a residential unit, but you're really using what is the equivalent of a commercial electric service, and so your meter fee is going to go up. 3-phase time of use metering, an RV park. where that RV may sit there not using any electricity hardly. The power company will charge you a higher meter fee just to make sure they get enough revenue out of you. Farm and home, where there's some farming equipment, and farms are generally in rural areas. But some other rates that come up are, say, net metering, where the power company says, well, if you're going to have a solar array on your grid and you're going to be reducing your electric bill with solar, what we'll do is we'll give you net metering. So for every kilowatt hour you push out onto the grid, we're going to give you near retail price for your outflow. That's what most of the U.S. defines as net metering. Or if you have a special net metering rate, it's near retail price for your outflow. It can get confusing because that's how the rest of the world, that's kind of the opposite of what they define net metering for. The rest of the world would call that a solar incentive of some sort. And so some power companies are saying, well, we'll give you a net metering plan, but we're going to increase your fixed fee so that you're still giving us our money to operate the grid in your area. And that's their prerogative, but some of these rates get pretty high. And so here are some of the most expensive non-specialized rate structures, where if you're just connected to the electric grid in these areas and you have their standard default electric rate, so every person on the block has this rate, where would you think these fixed fees are highest? I might think California or New York City, but actually where these fixed fees are the highest tend to be in more rural areas, where the power company says, hey, our maintenance costs are high, and we might get, grandma and grandpa living at home, not using any electrical devices, hardly at all, maybe not even turning the lights on. And it's like, okay, well, you have LED lights now. They don't use as much electricity as before, but they're just so stingy with their electric use. They have very low rates and very low bills, and they're very aware of their electric bills. They're on a fixed income. They're not trying to have any surprises with their electric use. Well, so some of the standard non-solar, non-special meter fees are getting up into not just $15 or $20, but $30 or $40 a month. And so once you get into these higher tiered fixed fees, you have to ask yourself, okay, well, how long do I need to save $45 a month before, I've paid off the cost of a battery? Well, $45 a month at 12 months a year, you're looking at $600 a year. And so if you're talking about a $20,000 battery bank, at $600 a year, you're still looking at, 25 years before you get anywhere close to that battery bank costs. And so, really your fixed meter fee has to be above this amount in order for going off grid to make sense. Or perhaps it's this plus something else that gets you to where you need to be to go off grid, where you already have a high fixed fee, and then there's something else about your electric use or solar incentive or buyback structure that tips the economics over the edge. So I would not discount these fixed fees. So, for example, in Mississippi, we don't have net metering. Well, technically, we do have net metering. Our state's net metering policy was essentially to define net metering as our net metering policy is to not have net metering. And they say, well, no, that is net metering because we've said it's net metering, but compared to everywhere else in the country, they would not say it's net metering. Like in other parts of the world, they define net metering as simply the right to interconnect solar to the grid. And so in that sense, we do have net metering because we have the right to interconnect solar to the grid. But whereas our electricity retail price is around 12 cents a kilowatt hour, our utilities will only buy back the surplus at around 3 cents a kilowatt hour. And that becomes very problematic for solar economics because, if I design a system to knock out 100% of my electric use, well, solar is only going to be working for, liberally 1/3 of the day. And so just to make the numbers simple, during that 1/3 of the day, 2/3 of my system is outflowing onto the grid, and only 1/3 of my system is being used by the grid. And in the wintertime or in the spring and fall, in the wintertime you use more electricity in the morning and at night than you do in the middle of the day. In the fall and spring, your electric loads are down, but the days are sunny and cool, so your production is up. In the summertime, you get more of an overlap between your air conditioning loads and your solar performance. But no matter how you design your system, if you're trying to go for 100% offset of your energy use, at least 2/3 of that solar power is going to be outflowing onto the grid. And so if I only get, 30% or 20% of retail value for that electricity, that large solar array is going to be wholly uneconomic. And that means you might only be able to do small solar arrays. But even if you just do a small solar array, you're still going to have outflow. In the winter time with a small solar array, your solar array is just not going to be producing very much electricity. The sun's low in the sky, you get overcast and cloudy days, and your electric use is high. And so if you do a small array in the winter time, you're not going to have this outflow problem. So you're going to get, whatever your energy rate is on your electric bill, you're going to get that rolled off. In the summertime, you have on a smaller solar array, you have air conditioning loads that do run throughout the day. Particularly, they escalate as the day gets hotter around noon all the way until about 7 p.m. And so, with a small kind of right-sized array, the outflow may not be that big of an issue. What I like to see when I commission a solar array in the summertime in Mississippi is that meter, instead of spinning backwards, it just stops and freezes right in place. The customer's not buying from the grid, they're not outflowing onto the grid. It's just that our production and our consumption are perfectly matched. But that only occurs for a limited window of time. There's some things you can do for load management that we'll talk about in the last 3 hours of the program to overcome that hurdle. But you still have spring and fall where even a small solar array is going to be producing some outflow because the spring and fall are good for solar production. You get bright, sunny days. You also have cool temperatures. And so your solar array will actually be producing a little bit more in the spring and fall, right smack dab in the middle of the day. I mean, in the summertime, your days are longer. So here we're going, from a little bit before 6 to, maybe 6:30 or so. And in the springtime, we're starting up a little bit after 6 and we're done by, 6:15. And so we get more energy out of an array during the summer, but we get more power. The maximum amplitude of this curve is higher in the spring and fall, and our consumption is lower because we don't have that air conditioning bill. And so even a small solar array is going to produce outflow. And so if you do not have a very good net metering, if you don't have a very good net metering policy, then that might alone ruin your solar economics. And so I had an off-grid customer in Mississippi who wanted to build a house in the middle of his property. The power company was going to charge him $20,000 to bring the power out to his property. We ended up going with a $22,000 battery bank. But also, one thing that tipped it over the edge is he wanted to do a solar array, and his power company had one of the worst net metering policies in the country, and that ticked him off. So he said, you know what? I want to do solar. I don't really want to pay $20,000 to a company who has written a policy where I don't get good value for my solar outflow, and so I'm not going to do it. I'll spend more money to go off-grid than I will to be grid connected, was basically his attitude. And, I agree with him. I mean, there's a compromise that can be had between retail price and avoided cost when it comes to clean on-site energy compensation. But often, especially with the regulated monopolies where they don't have any competition, they don't have any motivation to provide a compromise. Whereas on regulated grids, Texas has a deregulated grid, and you can get a better solar offer for your outflow than what you can get. And they don't even have net metering. So they have zero net metering laws on the books. It's just they have a deregulated grid, and the free market values solar outflow at around 60 to 70% of retail value. And over in Mississippi, where you really need to have more, out in the countryside generated power rather than a centralized power plant, you should have a better solar policy, not a worse solar policy, but in fact you only get about 20% of retail, and there's no choice, there's no competition. So one thing that's interesting when you don't have net metering is the concept of, okay, well, I can just store my electricity in a battery, and so instead of outflowing onto the grid, I'll store it in a battery, and then I'll use that power at night to lower my electric bill. So I'm no longer outflowing to the electric grid at 3 cents. I'm storing it and then saving 12 cents at night. And at face value, that concept of day trading your electricity seems to make sense. But what it doesn't take into account that you had to buy the battery to get there. And your battery does not have infinite life. In fact, its life goes down for every kilowatt hour that you charge and discharge it with. It gets a little bit more plaque on the anode and cathode of the battery that covers the holes where the electrons and the ions push through during their energy exchange. It leaves behind a particulate that covers those plates up, and now the electrons can't get through, and that's a function of usage. And so to day trade your electricity by not outflowing and then using it at night, that reflects a real cost of using your battery. And so when you look at this difference between, say, getting 12 cents for your inflow and 3 cents for your outflow, and you say, well, I hate my utility policy, so I'm gonna buy a battery and use it to reduce my electric bill. Your batteries cost, if you're doing a great job, 11 or 12 cents a kilowatt hour to run. In the case of the Tesla Powerwall, if you take the cost of the Powerwall and the warranted output of the Powerwall, you're up at 17 cents a kilowatt hour to run. And so the concept of storing all the energy into a lithium-ion battery bank during the day to reduce your electric bill at night, if you did a complete economic analysis of that, you'd realize that, hey, even though I just told you that the buyback at avoided cost, the buyback at 20% of retail is a bad deal for the solar customer, it would be even a worse deal to store that electricity in a battery to reduce your electric bill, because the cost of the battery would be more than the cost savings of that process, other than in your extreme electric markets, like some locations on the Northeast coast, some locations in California, and then like Alaska or Hawaii or Puerto Rico, areas where your electricity costs get really extreme because of their geography. And so the funny thing is, you'll still get customers saying, well, I don't care about that. I want to buy the battery and I want to reduce my electric bill, because they have the money to burn and they really just want to get out of paying their electric bill. And so I call that a spiteful battery, where they'd rather spend more money on a battery than to give the utility a cent of electricity from their solar array, simply because their solar policy is so bad that it ticks them off, and they say, I'd rather put more money into my own property than participate in the utility's terrible solar policy, even though at the end of the day it's going to cost me more money to do so. I don't mind. I'd rather waste my own money how I see fit than because I don't have any other choice. But what that means is you get into a upper limit on how large of a solar array you can do. Larger solar arrays are more cost effective than smaller solar arrays, in the sense that you get economies of scale. And so, when I look at the cost of solar, I'm doing a 15 kilowatt solar array right now that I bid $1.71 a watt plus sales tax on. And the only way I was able to get that $1.71 a watt install price is because it's a 15 kilowatt solar array. It's large. It doesn't cost me more money to design a 15 kilowatt array versus an 8 kilowatt array. It doesn't really take that much longer to install. And in this case, it's a one-story building with 3 rows of panels. And so whether those rows of panels are 12 modules long or 15 modules long, it really doesn't double my amount of time in order to tack on more modules onto the end of the row. To some extent, your purchasing costs per unit go down, because you can buy spools of cable, you can buy boxes of DC optimizers and bolts and nuts, and so there are real economies of scale to be had with larger systems rather than smaller systems. So ironically, you might get a quote on a 4 kilowatt system at $4 a watt, and it comes out to be $16,000. Or then you go and get a quote for a 6 kilowatt system at $3 a watt, and it comes out to be $18,000. And then you go get a quote for a 15 kilowatt system, and all of a sudden you're below $2 a watt, and you're below $30,000. But because of the terrible lack of net metering in many jurisdictions across the country, and the trend is to go away from net metering, you get into this kind of sweet spot where, it really doesn't make sense to oversize the array, and then undersizing it too much, you get into those economies of scale, on the other end that are quite punishing. And so it just kind of turns out that a good system size for a home is around 7 kilowatts of solar. One pallet of solar modules is kind of the most you can do when you don't have a strong net metering policy in your area. But just to kind of look at some cost differences here, buying that 10 kilowatt inverter doesn't cost you 3 1/3 times as much as the 3 kilowatt inverter. So you get good economies of scale on your system components, on your labor, on your permitting costs. Your solar installer, they do have to make a certain amount of money. I'm not trying to make just $1,000 of profit off of one project. And so if I get a 3 kilowatt project, I'm bidding $5 a watt on it, and I have some of the best pricing in my area. but that's only for the larger systems because there's just a certain amount of money I need to take home with me to do a project. And so that's kind of one way that your grid tied solar economics, they're just subject to the rules and regulations of your local grid. And so if the deck is stacked against you, that might push you into off-grid making more sense. Whereas if you are in a market where they have a good net metering policy, I'm not even saying an aggressive one, I'm just saying one that's fair, there might be more of an incentive to stay grid connected. And then there's another kind of hidden penalty for solar users, and this applies to low energy users as well, which is your just standard electric rate structure. So let's say you're not in California where they have a dozen different electric rate structures that are based on how much electricity you use. There's such a thing as a progressive rate structure where the more electricity you use, the higher your electric rate goes. The opposite would be a regressive rate structure, where the less electricity you use, where the more electricity you use, the lower your rate goes. And then there would be the flat rate structure, where just everyone gets the same rate structure. No matter how much electricity you use, it's 12 cents a kilowatt hour. And so let's look at a rate structure where you're spending $20 a month as a fixed fee and then being billed 12 cents a kilowatt hour for your electricity. It sounds like a pretty straightforward rate structure, right? Well, let's say you're a grandma and grandpa who, you don't know how they only use this little amount of electricity, but they do. It's like, do y'all really just live in the dark and never open your refrigerator, and don't run the air? You keep the thermostat at 78. Like, how do you use such little electricity? But they do. And then you have the energy hog that, they have big homes. They say, well, I'm not going to swap out for LEDs because I like the light quality of the incandescents better. And, or it's an all-electric home, electric water heating, electric cooking. Maybe there's a swimming pool or a hot tub on electric heater where the usage can go even higher than this. And so, there's should be no surprise there's a big, wide difference between the amount of electricity someone uses. Well, if they're all on this $20 a month fixed fee plus 12 cent a kilowatt hour rate structure, you take that fixed fee and the amount of energy they're using, and then you multiply it by the 12 cents a kilowatt hour, and then you tabulate their bill, and then you divide it back by the amount of electricity they used. And it turns out that this a flat rate structure is a regressive rate structure, where the more electricity you use, the lower your electric rate gets, because that fixed fee is a smaller portion of your bill. So it turns out that grandma and grandpa are paying 16 cents a kilowatt hour, whereas mom and dad are spending 13 cents a kilowatt hour. And so it may be that if you are in a very energy efficient home, if you have a propane tank or a natural gas tank for your heating, for your cooking, if you have a gas connection on your property but the electric service hasn't been built out yet, and you plan on living in a smaller home rather than a larger home, if you live by yourself, if you don't have any kids, if you are crazy with your energy efficiency, there's a lot of reasons why you might go with not using very much electricity, and one of them is because you have a solar array on your rooftop. And so kind of ironically, the more you reduce your electric bill because of solar, the higher your rate goes because of these fixed fees. And so you might have a solar customer who's paying 13 cents a kilowatt hour, go solar, and knock out 3/4 of their energy use, and all of a sudden their rate for the remainder is 16 cents a kilowatt hour. And so it's playing this grid tie game. The point is there's a lot of ways that a power company can slice and dice an electric bill to reduce the value of solar. And it's in their business interest to do so. Now, I am not trying to rail against business interests. It makes the world go round. But there are instances where one company has a monopoly on an area, and then they do not provide good solar policies to their customers. They might even be a very solar-friendly utility that does a lot of utility-scale solar and says, oh, we love the environment. They could be a 100% solar utility and be completely clean and be 100% solar-powered, but completely skew the deck so that it's just utility-scale solar, and at the same time provide terrible solar policies to their own consumers. And so I do think that is not admirable if they have a monopoly. I do think that if you live in a regulated grid where you don't have any choice on who your power provider is, that should entitle you to more rights than what you would get on a deregulated grid. So if you're subject to a monopoly, you should get some entitlements in exchange for that monopoly. If you don't have the monopoly, then you don't have the right to those entitlements. It's you give the monopoly to the company in order to have a better quality of life than what you would get without the monopoly. Otherwise, the system doesn't work. And so here in Mississippi, we got Touchstone Energy, which is most electric cooperatives throughout the country that are not municipalities, that are not the smaller cities and rural areas, but are the true electrical cooperatives. They've kind of banded together and formed a cooperative for electric cooperatives. And at least in Mississippi, where they're not state obligated to provide good net metering, they provide just a little bit better than what avoided cost is at 4.5 cents. Another way that a utility could kind of influence the bill is to tack on a solar discriminatory rate structure, where if you go solar, they're going to add $10 a month to your electric bill. And you could say, okay, well, what if I design a system where I'm off-grid during the day, and then at night I have a transfer switch and I switch over to grid power. So I'm off-grid during the day and I'm on-grid at night, but my solar array is never interconnected to the electric grid. Well, the power companies are saying, we don't care. If your solar array is connected to the same electrical wiring that at some time powers what our electric grid powers, we're going to consider you to be grid connected, even though you might not be physically grid connected, and we're going to charge you that solar discriminatory rate structure, even though you're not outflowing anything onto the grid. That's happening right now. It's reality. A facility upgrade fee where they charge you to come out and put a digital bidirectional smart meter on your property. So what happens in Mississippi is we still are on analog meters that'll spin forwards or spin backwards, and so because they spin backwards, they inherently have retail price net metering built into them. And so when you drop off the solar application, that's when the utility comes out, puts on the bidirectional meter, strips your net metering ability from you, and charges you for that privilege. Now, another thing that happens is that when you fill out your solar application, they say, okay, well, do you want to go on to our time of day rate structure? Because now that we have these smart grids, we can give you a higher rate during the day and a lower rate at night. And because you have a solar array, you avoid that higher rate during the day, and now you have a lower rate at night, so you end up saving money. Well, you have to actually go and read those time of day rate structures, because this is not always the case, but there are cases where the time of day rate is going to be less economic for the customer than the standard rate. And so you know sometimes it's a little bit of, you almost feel like you're being snookered when they put you onto the time of use rate. I've had utilities call me and say, well, don't you want to take the time of use rate? And it's like, no, you don't. You know, we're doing some energy management. We're not planning on outflowing. We're lowering our, you know, we're load shifting. We're matching our solar array to the load, and we'll take the basic rate with the that's going to be more economic for this particular customer. Now, this is the Tennessee Valley Authority. And they have all of Tennessee and then kind of greater Tennessee. So like North Mississippi, North Alabama, South Kentucky, West Virginia. You know, they're a little bit greater than Tennessee. And Tennessee does not have any net metering policy. They've had a buy-all, sell-all program that in the past has paid above retail. But the problem with buy-all, sell-all is that it's not connected to your electric service. So if the power goes out, your solar array goes out, and you have zero ability to add batteries to the solar array and use it in an off-grid setting. So if you want the backup power capability of solar, you can't do the buy-all, sell-all program. And furthermore, nowadays the TVA's buy-all, sell-all program still pays below retail value for all of the solar array's electricity. And so often you'll get in a circumstance where the buy-all, sell-all program is worse economically than the zero net metering option, which is what they give you. And that really ticks me off, because they've gone to, say, Mississippi and said, we don't have to give outflow at 4 cents, which is the state law. We're only going to pay 2.5 cents, which is the federal minimum, because we already have a net metering program for our customers. And so they call what is exactly not a net metered connection, which is a buy-all, sell-all connection. 2 different meters, 2 different electric services. They're not interconnected in the slightest. Well, they say, well, that's our net metering program. You know, that's a horrible misuse of any definition of net metering that I know of. And it's confusing. It confuses out-of-state developers who go and sell wrong systems to the customers. The customers don't get what they think they're buying. The out-of-state developers don't understand what they're selling. And it's a big mess, is what it is. Well, then you go into the TVA 2008 rate structure proposal, and they throw distributed renewable energy completely under the bus. Even though the TVA pays avoided cost outflow for net metered interconnections, and they're a public utility monopoly charged with bringing power out to the most rural sections of the United States. They're a public entity. They should be looking out for the best interests of their consumers. You know, they're not a private company. They're not publicly traded on the stock market. They're not beholden to shareholders or investors as you would get in an economically competitive grid under grid deregulation. But instead, they're a public monopoly who provides the worst solar policy in the country to their public. And what they've said is the objective purpose of our rate changes is that there's rate pressure because of distributed energy. And in order to enhance fairness so that costs are not shifted between consumers, in order to serve our mission to improve quality of life, we say that our distributed energy policies over-incentivize consumer solar, and that leads to uneconomic results. We don't need new sources of power. There's an imbalance created by this distributed energy investment that we don't need, that are shifting costs onto non-solar owners who cannot afford distributed energy, or for those who choose not to invest in distributed energy. And therefore, our rate structures are going to penalize consumer-owned solar. And so they've basically allowed all of their electric co-ops to double their meter fees. And so right now you go to 4 County Electric, you're paying $20 a month in your meter fee. They're allowed to double that up to $40 a month. You know, so we see the trend that's to come is to say we're not going to increase the price of electricity. In the past, when we've needed to increase the price of electricity, that's what we've done. But we're not going to do that anymore. Instead, we're going to let our grid operators increase those fixed fees, because that is going to devalue consumer-owned solar even further. And that is the exact opposite direction that they need to be going in. There is no more cost-effective way to bring clean power to the grid than consumer-sided solar power. They say, well, but what about utility economies of scale? Well, a centralized power grid, you still have to transmit that electricity, you still have to mark it up and distribute it. And furthermore, when a disaster strikes, a centralized power grid doesn't give you that reliability that on-site consumer solar does. But here in reality, not talking about what should be happening, but what is happening, you know, the TVA in page 1 of their executive summary of 2018 rate change proposals, they say it's consumer-owned solar that's the problem, and we're going to make it a lot worse rather than better for those customers. Now, this is the most extreme example that I've seen in Mississippi for electric cooperatives. This is Coastal Electric. In order to add solar to your property, they're going to increase your meter fee by $15 a month. So this is a solar discriminatory rate structure that only applies to solar customers. So what, are we going to have a backup generator discriminatory rate structure, and an electric vehicle discriminatory rate structure, and a energy efficient home discriminatory rate structure? Well, the argument has been, well, those don't outflow anything onto the grid. Well, I can design a solar array that doesn't outflow anything onto the grid. Am I still going to get the discriminatory rate structure? Well, why would you do that? Don't you want to sell back to the utility? Well, not if it's going to cost me money. In fact, this is the furthest interpretation that you can take when you don't have a solar policy. So this is what PURPA, which is PURPA in the United States is the right to interconnect and sell back at avoided cost. This is what PURPA entitles clean generators to. And that's the right to interconnect and sell back at avoided cost, less an administrative fee. And so here we have that $15 a month administrative fee. And then what they subtract out on top of that is they take the avoided cost rate, and then they subtract a service fee for every kilowatt hour that's outflowed onto the grid. And so what happens is you take that $15 a month, and then you take the avoided cost buyback rate in the area, and then you subtract out their per kilowatt hour service fee. And what it comes out to is you need to produce 477 kilowatt hours a month just to overcome that additional rider that they've tacked onto your bill because you have solar. And to say, okay, well, what size of an array do I need to generate 477 kilowatt hours a month? And it turns out to be a 4 kilowatt solar array. And so if I'm doing solar at $2 a watt and I have to add a 4 kilowatt array onto the system just to overcome the rider, because at that point it's all going to be outflow, what that means is the customer effectively has to spend $8,000 more on their solar array in order to overcome the local tax that's been placed on them by their utility monopoly. And so that's, at that point they say, forget all this, I'm going off the grid. So in Mississippi, and I'm mentioning this because my audience, there's a lot of solar installers in the audience, and they may find themselves in rural areas that have very similar policies to Mississippi. Mississippi is not the only state in the country like this. Historically, it was the first state in the country to have an electric cooperative, and so most of our state is like this. But the Public Utility Commission says, you know what, the only way to overcome that monopoly is to get it decertified. And, what we're really concerned about is the safety and well-being of the customer. And if they were to decertify, you would have to prove that your power source is safer or more safe and more reliable than what the grid monopoly can currently offer. Otherwise, then, and it has to be economic too. But otherwise, we're not going to give you the right to sell electricity to a customer in that region. And the reason why that's important is there's a lot of grandma and grandpas out there who may not have the money to go off grid, but they're paying 16 or 17 cents a kilowatt hour for their electricity, and they need their electricity because of medical equipment, and they're losing power on a regular basis, and they really don't have any access to a solar policy that is economic for them. And so while you might be able to take those low energy users off the grid in an economic manner, you're prevented from doing so by the state public utility policy. And so you have to argue to them, well, why is the policy wrong? Why is the policy a threat to health, safety, and welfare? So this gets into a debate between overhead and underground wiring on which is better, overhead or underground. So we saw earlier that underground wiring costs a lot more than overhead. And so is the advantages of underground wiring really that much better? And depending on who you ask, you're going to get different answers. This is a chart that shows the average customer interruption duration for overhead versus underground wiring. And it almost looks like there's little difference between overhead and underground wiring. That, in some cases there's a little bit more overhead. The D is distribution, for the customer. The T and D is for transmission and distribution. And so while there are some cases where the overhead wiring has a longer outage than the underground wiring, there's also instances where the underground wiring has a greater outage than the overhead. So you could say, well, it's kind of a wash. But this is for the customer average interruption duration. So when there is a power outage, how long is the power out for? And that's not the whole story. Here is another way to calculate the numbers that's called the System Average Interruption Duration Index. If you notice the difference between the two, it's the customer average interruption duration versus the system average interruption duration. And so it turns out that the systems are interrupted much longer by overhead wiring work rather than the customer being interrupted. And so the system is out longer for overhead power lines, whereas on a customer average, the underground wiring, when it does fail, the underground wiring takes a while to repair. But if you look at the whole, so if you take just the instant point in time to say how long does the grid go out at this instant point of time, what is the average time that the power is out, it turns out that it's about the same for repairing underground power lines. The power fails longer, but it fails less often. Whereas with the system average interruption duration, what we see is that when there is an overhead power failure for the entire year, you look at not just the instant of how long does the customer lose power for that one failure, but you say, okay, well, you count up all the minutes that the whole system is down for overhead versus underground, and we see that the system loses power for a much longer time cumulatively because of overhead wiring. In other words, underground wiring is more reliable than overhead wiring. It's just that overhead wiring is cheaper to build and cheaper to repair, and so if you don't want to come up for the capital expense of burying your lines underground, you go with overhead, but it results in a less reliable grid. And then that's proved by when you look at the frequency. So it's not just the duration of the outage or the cumulative duration of the outage, but the frequency of the outages. We see that overhead lines fail much more frequently than underground lines. And so that begs the question for reliability, which is more reliable, overhead lines or underground lines? Well, it's clear. The underground lines fail less often. When they do fail, they take longer to repair, but they fail less often, and when you multiply the duration of the outage by the frequency of the outage, you get the cumulative system outages, and we see that the problem is much more likely to occur with overhead lines. And so that begs the question, well, when it comes to off-grid solar, is it more reliable or less reliable than a grid connection? Well, what is that grid connection? It's either going to be overhead lines or underground lines. And we can clearly conclude that overhead lines are less reliable than underground lines. And so what is a solar array like? Is it like an overhead line, or is it like an underground line? Well, I would argue that it's like, if you only had those two choices, it's like an underground line. If I'm doing a ground mount, my lines are going underground. No tree is going to fall on them. Okay, well, my solar array's on a roof, so I guess it's overhead, but on my conduit is going into my building or alongside my building. Nothing's going to happen to that unless something happens to the building. If a tornado, the tornado would have to rip the building apart for that building to lose power, whereas a tornado could go rip up the power line or distribution station or the substation. It's clearly generating your own power and storing your own power on site is more reliable than either of these two options. as long as the system is well designed. And so on-site, off-grid solar is more reliable than the electric grid. And so if you can decertify your local monopoly because your business model is to provide off-grid power to these customers, and you're faced with a state law that says, oh, you're not allowed to do that because you're not allowed to sell electricity to these customers because this other company has the monopoly, you should go to your Public Utility Commission and say, look, my power generation is not offered by my other customer. You know, there's some power companies like Green Mountain Power that is helping some customers go off grid. And if these electric cooperatives in these rural areas were smart, they would look at their most rural distribution circuits and say, these are our most costly circuits, so let's take those customers off grid. If these cooperatives were smart, they'd say, we have a golden Rolodex of all of our customers, and we have access to low interest financing for assets. We have everything in place we need to start disassembling the electric grid and taking all of these customers off grid. But they're not doing that. And so then you say to the Public Utility Commission, they're not doing that, and I am. So I want the right to sell off-grid electricity to these customers in the name of health, safety, and welfare. And the welfare part is it economic? And so that's the challenge. But the health and safety aspect is, you know, it's healthier. Not just saying that it's clean energy, but you know, the lights are going to stay on when the grid goes down so that the medical equipment, backup power, emergency power, that all remains in place. Safety, you can say, well, it's a lot safer for a company to own and operate these battery banks, to maintain them, to install the array, to make sure it, you know, on annually that it's properly maintained. So, you know, that's why you need a third party. You know, sure, a customer can go and buy the system on their own and maintain it and save money and whatnot, but not all customers are electricians or even wanting to do the system maintenance. So there is a need for a external party to come in there and take over some of those roles and responsibilities. So there's the health, there's the safety, and the last part is the economics, the welfare. And so you look at the price of electricity and you say, well, clearly there are some benefits to off-grid solar power, so maybe we don't have to be exactly at retail price, but we have to be close to it. And I'm telling you right now, the cost of off-grid solar, when you finance it over a low-interest long-term loan, just like solar did 10 years ago, where you take a 20-year loan and a 15-year payback, and the loan payments are about the same as the cost savings. We're getting right to that point with off-grid solar now, where if you have the same access to long-term, low-interest financing that every utility cooperative in the country has access to by going to the federal government and applying for loans, you know, forming an off-grid electric cooperative where you can take customers off-grid as long as you have the endorsement of the state, you know, that's not out of the realm of possibility, particularly in these areas like the TVA, where you might only have 5 customers per mile of power line. All right. Well, what about the customer says, I want to do solar, I want to do batteries, but I am connected to the grid, so I'm kind of uncomfortable with going off grid. Can I just stay grid connected and still have solar and batteries? And the answer is yes, but you might be disappointed nonetheless. The thing is, you look at, say, this popular solar battery, the Solar Edge storage system, and they use a lithium-ion battery pack. So this is what you'll get out of systems like the Tesla Powerwall, pretty much any lithium-ion system. You know, Pika inverter, good inverter company, they're the same way. You know, you go and you look at what they power, and they say, okay, well, you have a grid-tied inverter that can outflow and sell back to the grid. And you have your electric service panel with all your loads on it. And then you have your inverter, and what we're going to do is we're going to wire a critical load panel to it. And we're going to rewire your electric service panel, and any critical loads we're going to put on to your backup. And your battery is going to supply the backup. You say, well, wait a minute, does that mean that my solar array during a power outage, it's not going to power my whole house? And the answer is, yeah, that's right. It's only going to power critical loads. Okay. Well, is my air conditioner going to be powered? If I'm losing power in the summertime in Mississippi, I want some air conditioning. Well, if you have a 240 volt air conditioning unit, and you say, okay, well, my solar inverter is 240 volts, so of course it should be able to power that. They say, well, hold on a minute. My critical load panel is only rated for 50 amps, and your AC air conditioner is on a 50 amp breaker. So if you want to back up your air conditioner, you really can't back up anything else. And I said, well, all of a sudden, and in fact, you go and you read the manuals and they say, no, you can't. I mean, yeah, you might be able to power your air conditioner, but you know what they say in the manuals is you're only allowed to back up smaller circuits. So like a plug-in window unit, a 120 volt air conditioner, you'd be more likely to back up than your central air. So that's kind of dissatisfying, isn't it? You know, if I have a solar array that's capable of knocking out my electric bill, and I go and spend, you know, $6,000 plus installation on a battery, I want to be able to power whatever I want during the power outage. Now, I understand I have to watch my electricity, but I definitely don't want the air conditioner to be off. You know, what's even interesting is that you say, okay, well, what then if I just do a larger system? So, you know, I have a critical load panel, but can I, you know, let's say I have a battery inverter, and right next to it I have a non-battery inverter. So my battery inverter may only be able to supply critical loads, but I have a giant solar array on my roof. So, you know, if I have a 6 kilowatt inverter, can I just have another 6 kilowatt inverter? So I have you know, let's say you want to retrofit your solar array that you currently have. And so right now you have a solar array and a non-battery inverter. And you say, well, can I just take my battery inverter and put it right next to my batteryless inverter, so during a blackout, I can power my whole house and not just critical loads? And the answer is no, you can't. Like, well, why not? Why can't I do that? And they say, well, the other problem is it has to do with this grid connection. You know, see, that inverter is tied in to the electric grid. And even though the grid is out, that switch is still down, and your grid and your inverter are still tied in together. And so in order for you just to automatically be selling back your electricity onto the grid, you don't have that automatic transfer switch between your solar array and the grid. And so even though you have a solar array and enough inverters on your house to power your house during a grid outage, you can still only power the backed up loads. In fact, you take a SolarEdge battery inverter and a SolarEdge batteryless inverter and put them on the same service panel during a blackout, even though you're wiring a communication circuit between the two inverters, you're still not allowed by the manufacturer to turn that batteryless system on and power your whole service panel. You say, okay, well, what if I go and I put a manual transfer switch between the grid and my home? You know, automatic transfer switches are kind of expensive, but what if I put a manual transfer switch there? Can I then turn on my whole system? The answer is no, you can't. And the reason is this output from the battery inverter is no longer outputting onto your service panel, so it's no longer giving a signal to your batteryless inverter to turn it on. Instead, there's a switch inside the battery inverter that is redirecting the signal just to your backed up loads. And so you say, okay, well, can I then let's see if I can get this to work here on my drawing tool. Let's see. Nope. I just messed everything up, didn't it? Let's see. Alright, so we're back here. Let me get off my laser pointer and get onto my drawing tool. So one item that I thought was, well, can we then oh, that's not working. How do I do this? Alt 2. Huh. Let's just go to the next slide. I'll use my laser pointer. There's a device that I think needs better recognition in the solar industry called a generator interlock switch. And so this is a plate that you put onto your electric service panel if you want to add a generator or a backup generator to your electric service panel, but you don't want the cost of an automatic system. Because the cost, an automatic transfer switch, I don't know why, but it's atrociously expensive. You know, an automatic transfer switch is $1,000 or more, whereas this plate, you might be able to get it for $50. And what this plate does is it's basically a physical plate, and these are little twist-off bolts that kind of, you know, they try and make this plate as permanent as it can be, but basically its function is to ensure that either the grid main breaker or the generator breaker are on versus off, but they're on versus off at opposite times. And so it's not automatic, it's manual. So the power goes out, you lose power, and then you have to go and flick this switch off, and then you're able, after you do that, to shift the plate over, which will allow you to flick the generator on, and then you crank the generator and have backup power. So for your high-end solar customers who don't know anything about electricity and don't really know about their electric service panels, they may want something that's more automatic than that. And your grid-tied backup does that automatic transfer to your backed up loads. But then again, it's not perfect, because if your customer wants not just backed up loads, but, you know, whole house power, they might say, well, what would happen if, let me try this one more time. Let me bring my, there we go. What would happen if I take this output on my storage inverter for backed up loads, and then I ran it to my main service panel and tied it in to this generator interlock? So it actually, you take the backup from your solar edge inverter and your backup breakers, and then you go and loop it around and tie it into that generator interlock? Well, the answer technically would be that your 120, 240 storage breaker with auto transformer could then awaken and turn on the batteryless inverters that were also supplied to the system. But SolarEdge says we don't support that. You're going to void your warranty if you do that. You know, if your loads are in balance, you could burn up the inverters. We're not going to honor our warranty, and we're not going to support that kind of design configuration. So we're going to kind of come back to that kind of concept tomorrow. Let's put that aside for now. So what happens if you want to not void your system warranties and you want whole house backup? Well, that's going to require that you go and buy a inverter system that is more expensive than the SolarEdge or the DC optimizers. That's more expensive than the Enphase microinverters. You know, it's going to require you to buy an inverter that has a high amperage output. You know, the SolarEdge storage inverter, it only has this kind of 50 total amp output. In fact, this is a 25 amp, 240 volt circuit. And so if your air conditioner, if your central air requires a 30 amp breaker, the SolarEdge storage system is not powerful enough to power your air conditioner. And so you only have a 25 amp output. And so what you need is a battery inverter that has a much higher amperage output. You know, maybe a 60 amp output or a 100 amp output. Or maybe you have to parallel a couple of these battery inverters together to get your amperage up. And so what you're kind of left with, if you want whole house backup and a solar array, and let's not kid ourselves, customers want whole house backup when they buy solar. In fact, most assume that's what they're getting right out of the gate. It's like, no, we can do solar to reduce your electric bill, but if you want backup power, it's going to cost a lot more money. Well, especially if you have no net metering policy, and the concept of day trading your electricity doesn't even make sense. You're kind of pigeonholed into a system like the storage system where you can do about 7 kilowatts of solar, and then you have limited, if you don't have batteries, you could go with the SMA system. You could get 7 kilowatts of solar and have limited power during the day without batteries. That's a special SMA feature, and SMA inverters cost a little bit more than non-SMA inverters accordingly. You know, or you could go with the SolarEdge feature, but both SMA and SolarEdge, they're only powering small powered backup circuits. They're not powering the whole house. You know, if you want a whole house backup, you have to go with the most expensive battery inverter system on the market that costs twice as much as a batteryless inverter. So if you want a whole house backup, you end up spending more on your inverters. Then you have to buy the batteries, and the system is less efficient too. You know, this kind of it starts to imply that, well, maybe grid connected batteries are very different than that concept of being off-grid. So it's not just that you're capable of being off-grid, but you have a grid connection. It's something different entirely. What are grid-connected batteries used for? What are they? Well, we come back to that amperage issue, where it's like, well, your central air conditioner is 30 amps and the double pole circuit, and the SolarEdge inverter is only outputting 25 amps double pole circuit. So it's not strong enough to power an air conditioner. It's like, well, so you're selling me a backup battery that's not strong enough to power an air conditioner. Why? Why is that? Well, often these solar batteries are lithium ion, and they're lithium ion, and lithium ion's at a higher voltage. Lithium ion batteries are often 350 volts, and that solar edge DC output circuit is 380 volts. And so they set the array output voltage to be similar to that of the lithium ion battery. It's a very efficient process. And it's all about efficiency because you want to go from the solar array to the battery, and then you want to sell back to the grid, so you don't want that to be an inefficient process. But if you took the array voltage and you dropped it down to 48 volts, and then you stepped it back up to 240 volts, and then you sold back to the grid, that would be an inefficient process. You would lose electricity in that process. Well, a volt times an amp is a watt. If you have high voltage, you have low amperage. If you have a 350 volt battery and a 15 kilowatt hour battery bank, a lot of these banks are not 15 kilowatt hours. They're 7 kilowatt hours, so they're half this. But let's just go and say 15 kilowatt hours. 15 kilowatt hour battery bank, in my opinion, is the minimum size you would want to provide whole house backup for a home. That's not even the size you want for off-grid living. That's like, okay, it's an emergency, the grid's out, I'm going to be sipping the electricity I'm using. A 15 kilowatt hour battery bank will get me through one night of managing my electricity until the sun comes back up and recharges it. It's not like the kind of living, it's disaster mode living. It's not the kind of living that the average American household is used to. High voltage, low amperage. And so, one kind of problem, one thing I'm struggling with is that when I go and I select my off-grid batteries, they're less expensive than the lithium-ion batteries, because I'm a big advocate of industrial flooded lead acid. And these industrial flooded lead acid batteries are substantially cheaper than lithium-ion. Their quality is very similar to lithium-ion, but they're designed for completely different applications. Generally they're 12 volt batteries to power, say, a 12 volt electric forklift, and then they put them into RVs to make a 24 volt battery bank, so you live in your mobile home or RV, and then for off-grid living you'll string them up into 48 volt batteries. And so we're at 48 volts, 12 volts to 48 volts instead of 350 volts. And so if I wanted a 15 kilowatt hour battery to provide true whole house backup to my home, if I spend the money on a 15 kilowatt hour battery and I spend it on lithium ion, I would get 40 amps of power. If I went and I spent that money on flooded lead acid, I would get up into the 800 to 1,000 amps of power. It's weird because it's the same amount of power. Remember, power is a volt times an amp. It's the same amount of energy, and energy is power, a volt times an amp, multiplied by an hour. A power hour is energy. And so the thing is, when you select a lower voltage battery bank and you're only trying to spend a little bit of money on your battery bank, you're not trying to run a home off-grid. It's just our grid-tied inverters that are used to this lithium-ion technology are simply not capable of cranking out the amperage that they need to run your whole house. And so it's almost like the off-grid inverters are less efficient because they go from high voltage down to low voltage for your battery bank, and then get you enough amperage to service a 200 amp service panel. But a grid connected battery, what they say is we're going to stay at high voltage because we want that electricity to efficiently charge our lithium ion banks. We want that electricity to stay up above 240 volts because we're pushing it back onto the grid. You know, we're trying to capture every single electron that comes out of the system and push it into cost savings on your electric bill. And so it simply turns out that there's almost a different strategy for a battery bank that's intended to be grid connected and lower your electric bill versus a battery that's off grid and, you know, produces enough output power to run your entire house. You know, it's not to say that you can't go off grid with lithium ion. You know, it's not to say that you can't do backup powers with lead acid. It's just that with, you know, if I wanted to just do a 15 kilowatt hour battery bank with lead acid, it's going to be a less efficient process because I'm taking that 600 volts from the solar array, stepping it all the way down to, you know, the cheapest I could do is not to go with 48 volts, but to go with 12 volts. So, you know, 12 volts times 845 amps, that's going to be about 8 kilowatts of power. So I do about 12 volts, you know, this one battery right here, this 11,000 amp hour multiplied by 12 volts, I would need a 12 volt battery inverter that would go from 12 volts up to 240 volts split phase. And it would just be a terribly inefficient inverter to go from 600 volts down to 12 volts, back up to 240 volts. If I went to a 48 volt system, then no longer would I be able to buy a 15 kilowatt hour battery bank. If I went with a 48 volt system, you know, 48 volts times 845 amps, you know, it's about 5 times 8. That would be about a 40 kilowatt hour battery would be the minimum that I could buy using flooded lead acid. And so the short of it is, if you're going to remain grid connected, you want a small battery. And lithium ion is a small, efficient battery. You know, if you're going to remain grid connected and you want to buy a spiteful battery that is simply used to charge your battery bank during the day and discharge it at night to reduce your electric bill as much as possible, you want that to be an efficient process, and so you want it to be a lithium ion battery. If your point is to take the electrons from your solar array and push it out onto the grid and sell backwards, you don't want to process that electricity all the way down to 12 volts or 48 volts. And so you're going to want to do a lithium ion battery. But if you want whole house backup power, your lithium ion batteries are simply, you're going to need to buy so many of them that it's going to be atrociously expensive. And so the battery inverters that are on the market that work with lithium ion batteries don't even try to supply a whole house backup solution. They just say, no, we're gonna let you wire up these kind of smaller critical loads. You know, your most important electronics will remain powered, but the rest of the house, no, that's going to be offline. And so even if you have a grid-tied solar array with a battery, more than likely, given the popular battery lithium-ion options on the market that are aimed at lowering your electric bill more than providing backup power, you're still not going to get whole house backup. And so if you want a whole house backup system, you're probably going to get into lead acid batteries, at which point your popular solar edge inverters stop supporting you. Grid-tied batteries are about lowering your electric bill, not about buying backup power. Your power companies, particularly your regulated monopolies, they don't want consumer-owned solar, and they are working against you to make consumer-owned solar less cost-effective. The electric grid, particularly in rural areas, is less reliable than an off-grid solar array. The key thing that's missing from the off-grid market is long-term financing, and that's changing. And if your power company is not currently being fair to you with your solar policy, it's not like they're just going to turn around and magically start being fair to you with your policy. So, for all of these reasons, if you want a system that does whole house backup power, you might as well say, well, really, what's the cost just to go completely off the grid from the get-go? Or, as we'll talk about at the tail end of the program, craft a strategy to kind of have your cake and eat it too. And while that might involve voiding a couple of manufacturer warranties, having your cake and eating it too is a very rare thing, and it might ultimately offer better cost savings than either option. And so the point is, yes, off-grid is expensive, but it's not necessarily less economic than remaining grid connected if you want to do solar and you're in a solar unfriendly market, especially when it comes to new construction. All right, so let's go ahead and take a break. That went over time, so let's take a break. I'm going to interrupt the live stream for recording purposes. This is our first time through, so I'm trying to record each section individually this time around. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop the live stream, get this onto YouTube, put it into the Slack group for our paid customers, and then we'll pick back up with electrical analysis. So, after these messages, probably in about 10 minutes or so, we'll be right back.